My parents swore I was vindictive for reporting my sister for stealing my identity, and then the judge asked my father one question he couldn't dodge, and his face drained like the truth just unplugged him. And that's when I realized my family wasn't protecting her. They were sacrificing me. So tell me, would you still stay quiet if your own blood tried to ruin your life? If you're interested in this topic, hit the like button, subscribe, and type interested in the comments. And I will give you a heart. The courthouse air felt cold in that over-air-conditioned way that makes your skin prickle even when it's sunny outside, and I swear the silence in that room had weight, like you could scoop it up with your hands and it would still be heavy, and I sat there in civilian clothes that felt like a costume because 3 weeks ago I was still Staff Sergeant Nadia Brooks, squared away, respected, the kind of person commanders trust with keys, codes, and responsibility, and then one buzzing notification turned my entire life into a file folder with a case number, and the craziest part is this. The person who broke me wasn't some stranger, it was my own sister, and the people who defended her weren't random witnesses, it was my parents, sitting behind her like I was the one on trial. I'm going to start right where it hurts, not with childhood backstory, not with family is complicated, because you already know that song, and I'm not here to sing it. I'm here to show you exactly how a family can smile at you and still sharpen the knife behind their back. The judge was up there flipping through papers, tired eyes, no theatrics, just facts, and my father was 3 rows behind me with his jaw clenched like he was bracing for impact, and my mother sat next to him gripping a tissue like it was a weapon, and my sister Brielle stared straight ahead like I was invisible, and I remember thinking, wow. It's wild how fast people can turn you into a ghost when your existence threatens their comfort. And then my mind kept snapping back to the beginning because this didn't start with court. It started with a credit alert on a random weekday, like the universe tapping me on the shoulder and saying, "You need to look at this right now." I was on base at Fort Cavazos, Texas, walking down a hallway that smelled like industrial cleaner and burnt coffee, listening to 2 privates argue about weekend duty like it was life or death. And then my phone vibrated, and it wasn't a text, it wasn't a call, it was that sterile little notification that usually means nothing, except this time it said significant change detected. And I tapped it without thinking because my habits are military. I check details, I check numbers, I don't leave loose ends. And when the credit score loaded, I literally stopped walking because it didn't make sense. And when something doesn't make sense to a soldier, that's the moment your body goes alert before your brain catches up. 3 months earlier, my score was solid, and now it looked like someone threw it off a cliff, and my fingers started to feel numb as I pulled up the report, and I saw it. One account, then another, and I'm not talking one little store card. I'm talking major banks, major limits, major balances, and it felt like reading a stranger's life while staring at my own name. And then my stomach did that hollow drop because the totals weren't oops. They were catastrophic, the kind that can choke your future and mess with your clearance. And I don't mean that in a dramatic way. I mean in a very real, your command will pull you into an office and treat you like a liability kind of way. So I called the first bank on the list right there, standing near a vending machine humming like it didn't care, and I tried to keep my voice even because that's what you learn, calm voice, clear words, no panic, and I said, "There has to be a mistake, I didn't open this account." And the woman on the phone paused like she was checking a script, and then she said, "Ma'am, these accounts were opened using your social security number." And I felt my breath hitch, because that sentence is a guillotine when it has your name in it, and then she read the billing address on file, and it was my parents' house. Same street. Same zip code. The place I grew up. The place my father still calls home, like it means safety. My knees literally weakened, and I had to lean against the wall because my body was trying to decide whether to fight, run, or pass out. I asked her to repeat it, and she did, and then I pulled up another account, and another, and the pattern wasn't a pattern anymore. It was a confession written in numbers. Charges at department stores, online shopping sprees, a balance transfer fee dated on my birthday, hotel stays, and I could almost see the shopping bags in my head because Brielle loved posting fresh start captions like she was a motivational poster with a credit limit. And then the ugly thought hit me, not maybe, but of course, because growing up, Brielle was always the one who needed saving, the sensitive one, the fragile one, the one my father worried about like she was made of glass, and I was always the one who handled it, the one who didn't need much, the one who was told, "You're strong, you'll be fine." Which sounds like praise until you realize it's just permission for people to neglect you. I walked outside into the Texas heat and it hit me like a wall, the sun pressing down, my uniform sticking to my skin, and I dial my father because when you're raised right, you think the truth is the fastest route to fixing things, and I needed an explanation that didn't end with me losing everything I built. He answered on the second ring, warm voice. "Hey, kiddo, what's going on?" Like he hadn't just been standing on the edge of a cliff with my future in his hands. I opened my mouth and nothing came out for a second because I was still searching for the version of reality where this was clerical error, and then I said it plain, "Dad, did Brielle open credit cards in my name?" And there was a pause, not confusion, not shock, not "what are you talking about?" Just silence. And if you've ever confronted someone and they don't deny it, you know that feeling. It's like your bones go cold because your body hears the truth before you do. And then he said, careful and controlled, "Why don't you come home this weekend and we'll talk about it?" And that's the moment I knew the problem wasn't just Brielle. It was the system that raised her to take and raised me to absorb. I drove home that weekend, just under 3 hours, and every mile of highway felt like a countdown. Scrub grass, faded billboards, heat mirage, and my thoughts looping like a broken track. How long? How much? What else? Who knew? And then I pulled up to the house and it looked the same. Beige siding, porch railing my dad repainted like he was keeping up appearances for the neighborhood, American flag frayed at the edges. And for a split second my brain tried to comfort me, tried to say, "You're overreacting, it's family, there's an explanation." And then I saw Brielle's car in the driveway, newer model than last year, and I sat in my own car with the engine off and keys in my hand, remembering being 10 with a scraped knee bleeding through jeans while my dad comforted Brielle because she missed a soccer goal, and he looked at me and said, "You're fine. Go wash up. Your sister needs me right now." And I didn't realize until that driveway moment that "you're fine" had been a life sentence. I walked inside, and nobody hugged me. And that detail matters because families who love you don't treat you like an inconvenient appointment. Brielle was on the couch scrolling. She looked up and smiled too fast and set her phone face down like she was hiding a crime scene. My mother was in the kitchen fussing with nothing, and my father leaned against the counter with arms crossed like I was the problem walking in. I didn't sit. I didn't ask politely. I said, "How long?" And my father did the classic move, the one parents do when they want control. He sighed like I was exhausting him and said, "Let's calm down." And I said it again, clearer. "How long have you been using my identity?" And Brielle's eyes flicked to him before she answered me, and right there you could see it, the hierarchy, the golden child reflex, the silent permission. She stood up, arms crossed, shrinking into herself like she wanted sympathy points, and she said, "I was going to tell you. I just needed time." And I felt my hands shake, but my voice stayed steady because anger was too expensive to waste, and I said, "Time to do what? Rack up $59,000? And my mother made this soft little gasp like she was shocked, like she hadn't been living in that house with the billing address. And I turned to her and said, "You knew?" And she looked down at the counter, and if you've ever watched someone avoid eye contact, you know that's a confession without words. And then Brielle snapped into defense mode and said, "I didn't steal anything, I borrowed it. And I want you to sit with how insane that is because only a person protected their whole life can call identity theft borrowing." And then she said something that made my skin crawl. She said, "You're in the military, you have steady pay, benefits, you're fine." And there it was again, the family motto, the excuse they used to justify sacrificing you. And I laughed once sharp because if I didn't laugh, I might have exploded. And I said, I'm not fine, my credit is destroyed. I could lose my clearance, my career. And my father waved it off and said, "That's dramatic." And I stared at him like he'd lost his mind because dramatic is crying at a commercial. This was felony-level fraud. And he said the sentence that should be engraved on a warning label. This is family. We don't call the police on family. And I felt something crack inside me. Not my temper, my hope. So I asked the practical question, the one nobody wants to answer. "So, what's the plan? I just pay for it." And my mother finally spoke like she was offering a reasonable compromise. "We thought maybe you could help her get back on track slowly over time." And I said, "Over time? This follows me for years." And Brielle sniffed and said, "I said sorry." Like an apology wipes bank statements clean, and then she added, "I can make payments when I can, but I can't sign anything legal." And I realized she didn't want to fix it. She wanted to keep the escape hatch open. Right here is where I need you to tell me something, because I know I'm not the only one who's lived this kind of twisted logic. So pause for half a second and drop where you're watching from, city and country, because I want to know how universal this mess is. And while you're typing it, tell me, would you have stayed quiet to keep the peace? Or would you have done what I did next? Because I tried one last offer. I said, "If she signs a repayment agreement, I won't go to the police." And Brielle shook her head immediately. "No, that's not fair." And my father nodded like she made a great point and said, "She's right. We're not turning this into a legal mess." And in that moment, I understood the real contract in my family wasn't love. It was maintenance. My job was to maintain their comfort and absorb their consequences. And then the calm hit me. That scary calm, the one that shows up when you finally stop begging for fairness. And I said, "Then I'll handle it myself." And my mother's eyes widened. "What does that mean?" And I said, "It means I'm filing a police report." And Brielle burst into tears like she was the victim, and my mother rushed to her like I'd stabbed her, and my father's face went red, and he pointed toward the door and said, "If you do this, don't come back here." And I walked out without yelling, because when you finally see the truth, you don't need volume, you need action. I drove back to base feeling unreal, like I was watching my own life from above, and on Monday, I filed the report, gave statements, handed over documents, and the detective didn't blink. She said, "This is identity theft, clear as day." And that should have been the end of the debate, but families like mine don't debate facts. They debate loyalty, and my father left a voicemail saying I'd embarrass the family, like my ruined future was less important than their reputation. And that's how I ended up in that courtroom, listening to my parents testify like I was vindictive for refusing to carry a crime that wasn't mine. And while everyone wanted me to be quiet and convenient, the judge was about to do something none of them expected. She was about to ask one question that would strip the excuses down to bone. And when she leaned forward, I realized my father's confidence wasn't confidence at all. It was a bluff, and bluffs collapse the second someone asks for receipts. The bailiff called the case number like he was reading a grocery item, and we all stood, and the judge walked in with that tired, no-nonsense energy that instantly kills courtroom theatrics. And I remember thinking, good, because my family thrives on theatrics, and I didn't come here to watch a performance. I came here to stop my life from being turned into their little family problem that I'm expected to swallow. I sat on the hard bench feeling every creak of wood under me, hands folded tight in my lap, shoulders back out of muscle memory, but inside my stomach was doing that slow churn like it knew something was about to snap. And then my parents walked in, and didn't even look at me. Not a glance. Not a nod. Nothing. They went straight to Brielle like she was the one who needed comfort, and my mother took her hand like I was the aggressor who'd shown up to attack her, and my father stood behind them like a wall, like his job was to block consequences from hitting his favorite child. That's the first thing people need to understand about betrayal. It isn't just the bad thing that happens, it's who moves their body toward you when it happens and who moves away. The judge reviewed the charges, identity theft, credit card fraud, multiple accounts, and when she read the total out loud, $59,000. It sounded different in the air than it did on paper, heavier, like it had mass. Brielle pleaded not guilty with a trembling voice that was just convincing enough to fool strangers, but not convincing enough to fool me, because I've seen her cry her way out of accountability since we were kids. Her attorney stood up, smooth suit, smooth words, and said they wanted to call character witnesses, and I felt my spine stiffen because I knew what that meant. Not proof, not facts, but a story. A soft story designed to make the courtroom feel sorry for the thief and suspicious of the victim. And then my mother took the stand first, hand on the Bible, swearing to tell the truth, and I almost laughed because in my family, truth has always been flexible, like a rubber band you stretch until it fits the version you want. My mother dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, and she looked at the judge and said, "She's not a criminal. She's a good girl." She got overwhelmed, and I could feel anger rise in my chest because overwhelmed doesn't create 7 accounts. Overwhelmed doesn't repeatedly enter a social security number. Overwhelmed doesn't max out cards and miss payments and keep going like it's a hobby. That's not overwhelmed. That's entitled. And then my mother did the thing that still makes my skin crawl. She turned slightly toward me without fully looking at me, like I was an object she didn't want to acknowledge, and she said, "Nadia has always been intense." And there it was, the first little smear, the setup, because they can't defend Brielle without poisoning me first. When she stepped down, she walked past me and didn't speak, just the faint perfume trail and a cold shoulder, like I was a stranger in her life instead of her daughter. Then my father took the stand. And if you've ever had that one parent you've put on a pedestal, the one you swear is different, the one you think would never turn on you, this is the part that will hit you in the throat. My father sat up straight, jaw tight, and he didn't cry, he didn't plead, he didn't beg. He went with righteousness, like he was the moral authority in the room. He told the judge he raised us to be loyal, that family handles things privately, and then he said the words that made my ears ring. My younger daughter is vindictive. She's using this to punish her sister. Vindictive. Like I enjoyed having my name dragged through fraud investigations. Like I enjoyed calling banks every day and begging them to believe I didn't destroy my own credit. Like I enjoyed sitting in a commander's office while my career hung in the air. That's what betrayal looks like when it wears a clean shirt and a calm voice. It looks like someone rewriting your pain as a personality flaw. I sat there listening to him, and I could feel myself split into 2 people. One was the soldier who wanted to stay composed because losing composure is what people expect from vindictive women, and the other was the little girl who wanted to stand up and say, "You're lying, you know you're lying, you're doing this because it's easier than admitting your golden child did something evil." But I didn't move. I didn't give them the satisfaction of turning my reaction into evidence. I just sat there and watched my father sink his own credibility with every sentence, because here's the thing about grown adults who lie in court. They forget that judges have heard it all, and they forget that paper doesn't get emotional. The judge didn't interrupt him, not once. She listened, pen moving slowly across a yellow pad. She looked down at the file, looked up at him, looked down again, like she was comparing his story to the evidence and letting him talk himself into a corner. And Brielle sat there at the table, eyes lowered, shoulders curled in, performing fragility like it was her job, and I remembered her Instagram posts, the boots, the phone, the hotel weekend, the fresh start energy captions, and I felt something in me go ice cold. Because this wasn't desperation. This was lifestyle. This was someone spending my name the way people spend gift cards, carefree, because they assume someone else will pay the balance. The judge asked a few clarifying questions first, boring procedural stuff, confirming the number of accounts, confirming the addresses, confirming the total. My father answered like the paperwork was annoying but inevitable. "That's what it says." "Yes, Your Honor." And then the defense attorney tried to slide in that angle. You know the one, the family dispute angle, like fraud is a misunderstanding that can be solved with a group hug. He said something about sibling conflict and emotions, and I saw the judge's mouth tighten just slightly, like she'd tasted something sour. And that's when the judge adjusted her glasses and said, calm as a surgeon, "Mr. and Mrs. Brooks, please remain standing." My parents froze. My mother's hands clutched her tissue, like it was going to save her. My father reached for her hand, like now they were the victims together. The judge said, "I've listened to your testimony. You believe your daughter Betrayal made a mistake. You believe this should have been handled privately. You believe Sergeant Brooks's actions are motivated by resentment rather than harm." My mother nodded quickly, eager, like she'd just been handed the microphone again. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge cut her off with one sentence that changed the room temperature. I didn't ask a question yet. Silence snapped into place, clean and sharp. And I swear, in that one moment, I felt my nervous system recalibrate because finally someone in authority was not buying the emotional manipulation. The judge looked down at the file and began reading facts like they were weights being placed on a scale. 7 credit card accounts opened. Total debt approximately $59,000. Accounts linked to your residence. She looked up. "Is that correct?" My father cleared his throat. "That's what the paperwork says." She nodded, then asked, "And you are aware identity theft and credit card fraud are felonies?" He said yes, like it was a formality. Then the judge paused, and this pause wasn't dramatic, it was surgical, like she was choosing the exact place to cut. She said, "I have one question." And you could feel every person in that room lean in without moving. Even the bailiff. Even the court reporter's fingers seemed to slow. The judge looked directly at my father, not at my mother, not at Betrayal, at him, because she knew who ran the emotional economy in my family. She asked, evenly, "At any point before or after this was discovered, did you offer to repay, co-sign, or otherwise assume responsibility for the $59,000 your daughter incurred in Sergeant Brooks's name?" My father opened his mouth and nothing came out. Not for 1 second. Not for 2. He stared at the floor like he was searching for an escape hatch under the tiles. My mother's breathing turned shallow, quick little breaths like panic trying to stay polite. Betrayal's attorney shifted in his seat. The judge waited. Then she said, gently but deadly, "I didn't ask if you could afford it. I asked if you offered." And that's when the whole lie fell apart because there was only one honest answer. My father swallowed hard and said, "No." That single word hit the room with a dull thud, like a gavel before the gavel. The judge didn't stop there. She followed up, one step at a time, like walking him down a hallway with no doors. "Did you propose a payment plan?" "No." "Did you contact any creditors on behalf of the victim?" "No." "Did you offer any form of restitution to Sergeant Brooks?" My father's shoulders sagged in small increments with every no, like gravity was finally finding him. And I didn't feel happy. I felt validated in the ugliest way, because it confirmed what I already knew. They didn't want to fix it, they wanted me to absorb it. The judge nodded once, like she'd suspected this all along, and she said, "You've asked this court to view Sergeant Brooks's report as vindictive, yet there is no evidence you took any steps to mitigate the harm she suffered. Instead, you expected her to carry the consequences alone." My mother started crying, not the controlled tears she used on the stand, real shaking sobs. And I almost felt sorry for her for half a heartbeat until I remembered she chose this. She chose her comfort over my future. The judge turned her attention to Betrayal and said the evidence was substantial. Accounts, transactions, communications, and this matter would proceed. And when Betrayal finally turned her head slightly, I caught her eyes, and there was no regret there, just anger, the kind of anger people get when their favorite trick stops working. And as everyone started shifting, whispering, gathering papers, I stood up on legs that felt strangely steady, and I realized the truth didn't need me to defend it anymore. But the fight wasn't over, because the moment we walked out of that courtroom, my family was going to stop pretending in public and start punishing in private, and I could already feel the next move coming like thunder behind a closed door. We walked out of that courtroom, and the sunlight hit like it had no idea my life had just been rearranged inside a building with bad carpet and colder air, and for about 5 seconds I felt lighter. Not because anything was fixed, but because someone in power finally said out loud what my family spent my whole life pretending wasn't true, that they expected me to carry the damage because I'm this strong one. And then my phone vibrated and reality came right back, a voicemail from an unknown number and 3 missed calls stacked like bullets, and I already knew what it was, because debt doesn't care that a judge just humbled your father. Debt wants its money every day, including weekends. I stood on the courthouse steps, looked down at my hands, and noticed my fingers were still curled like I was gripping a weapon, and then I made myself relax them one by one, slow, deliberate, because if I let my body stay in fight mode, I'd spend the rest of my life there. The first call I returned wasn't even to family, it was to Detective Lewis, because I'd learned the hard way that my parents move in silence, but paperwork moves louder, and I needed to stay ahead of whatever storyline they were about to build next. They testified, I told her, walking to my car with my keys already sweating in my palm. They tried to paint me as vindictive. Detective Lewis didn't sound surprised. She sounded tired, like she'd heard the same family script in 1,000 different voices. That's common, she said, and then she added, what matters is they admitted they didn't offer restitution. That plays well for accountability. I got into my car, shut the door, and for the first time all day, I let myself breathe out fully, the kind of exhale you don't realize you've been holding for weeks. And then my phone lit up again, and this time it was my father calling. Not texting, not leaving a polite message, calling like he still had the right to reach into my day and rearrange my nerves. I stared at the screen until it stopped, and then it rang again, and I didn't answer because if I answered, I'd hear his voice, and his voice would try to shove me back into my old role, the one who soothes, the one who compromises, the one who says okay just to end the tension. Instead, I drove. The road out of the courthouse parking lot was narrow and lined with those tiny shrubs nobody waters, and as I merged into traffic, I watched my rearview mirror like I expected to see my family's car behind me, because that's how paranoia starts, not with crazy thoughts, with pattern recognition. On the way back to base, my mother finally texted, a single line that looked harmless if you didn't know her, "We need to talk about what you've done." And I actually laughed. One sharp sound that startled me, because it wasn't the anger that got me, it was the audacity, the way she framed this like I'd committed the crime, and she was the injured party. And then I remembered something my drill sergeant used to say, if you want to know who someone is, watch who they blame when they're caught. I got back to Fort Cavazos late afternoon, the Texas heat still clinging to everything like a wet towel, and I went straight to my office because I wasn't going to let my personal chaos bleed into my professional reputation, not when my clearance could be touched by the stink of unexplained debt. My commanding officer called me in before I even sat down. No small talk, no how you holding up, just that military efficiency that feels cold until you realize it's also a kind of respect. He slid a printed update across his desk, court date noted, fraud report documented. You did the right thing, he said, and I could have cried right there, not because I needed praise, but because it was the first time an authority figure said that without attaching a guilt trip. I nodded and said, "Yes, sir." And then I walked out, and my legs felt steadier than they had in months. But steadier doesn't mean safe. That night the calls started again, banks, collectors, automated systems that don't care you're a victim, and I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, a legal pad next to it, and I went into full operational mode, because that's what I do when I'm scared. I plan. I pulled my credit reports, highlighted every fraudulent account, printed the police report, printed the hearing summary, and then I started building what I called the paper shield, because when your family is gaslighting you, evidence is oxygen. And then the strangest thing happened. I got a message request on social media from someone I hadn't talked to in years, a cousin who usually stays out of drama, and it said, "Why are you doing this to your sister?" And I just stared at it because my parents weren't just punishing me privately, they were broadcasting their version of me to the whole family, like a warning label. I didn't respond. I took screenshots. I started a folder. Because here's a moral lesson I wish I learned earlier. Sometimes the person who betrays you doesn't just steal your money. They try to steal your reputation, so you have no allies left to tell the truth to. And then, 2 days later, I got the first real punch. A certified letter showed up at my door. My father's handwriting on the return address, the same tight, controlled script he used on birthday cards when he couldn't be bothered to say something warm. I opened it, and my stomach sank because it wasn't an apology. It was a threat dressed up as concern. Pages of family loyalty. "You're ruining your sister's future. You're mentally unstable." And then the worst line, the one that told me exactly how far they were willing to go. "If you continue, we will speak to your chain of command about your emotional state." They were trying to weaponize my career against me. That's when I realized this wasn't just favoritism anymore, it was warfare. I called Detective Lewis and read it to her, and she went quiet for a beat, and then she said, "Keep that letter. Don't respond. This is intimidation." And then she added, "Also, you need to document any attempt to contact you through third parties." That night I couldn't sleep, so I did what I always do. When sleep won't come, I cleaned. I wiped counters that were already clean. I lined up my boots perfectly. I folded a towel like it was a mission because my mind needed something physical to control. And then, around 2 a.m., my phone buzzed with a number I recognized. Brielle. It hit me like a slap because she wasn't supposed to contact me, and I just stared, heart thudding. Because for a second I thought, maybe she's finally going to say sorry. Maybe she's finally going to admit she did it. Maybe she's finally going to stop acting like I'm the villain. I answered, and the first thing she said wasn't, "I'm sorry." It was, "You think you're better than me." That's when I knew this wasn't remorse. It was resentment. She started ranting, voice tight and furious, talking about how she needed, how I always had everything together, how I could handle it. And then she said the most disgusting thing I've ever heard from someone who claims to be family. "If you drop this, Dad will forgive you." Forgive me. Like I'd committed the sin. I put the phone on speaker, opened my notes app, and started writing down every word because if she was going to violate a no-contact order, I was going to turn her mouth into evidence. She realized what I was doing and snapped, "Are you recording me?" And I said, "I'm documenting you." And then she hung up. My hands were shaking, but my head was clear. I emailed Detective Lewis immediately, time, number, summary, and then I went back to my table and kept building my paper shield. And right here, I want to pause and ask you something because I'm genuinely curious and I need you in this with me. Where are you watching from right now? What city, what state, or what country? Because I swear stories like this happen everywhere, and the comment section always turns into a support group and a courtroom at the same time, and I want to know who's in this room with me. And while you're typing that, tell me this too, if your sibling stole your identity and your parents called you vindictive for reporting it, would you have done what I did, or would you have swallowed it to keep the peace? Be honest, because keeping the peace is just a pretty phrase for letting the loudest person win. After that call, the next week became a blur of follow-ups, because fraud doesn't resolve itself with one brave moment. It resolves itself with 20 boring steps you have to repeat until the system finally believes you. I called each creditor. I filed disputes, I sent affidavits, I followed the exact script banks require, because if you miss one line, they treat it like consent. I set calendar reminders for every deadline, I kept copies of everything, I sent documents certified mail, return receipt requested, and then I made a spreadsheet tracking the status of each account like it was a supply chain, because my name was the product being damaged, and I needed to stop the bleeding. And then the family pressure escalated again. An aunt called, voice sweet like poison. Your mother's heart is breaking. And I said, mine was too when she chose my sister. And the aunt went quiet, and then she said, but family is family. And I replied, then why didn't family act like family when my name was being used like a coupon? I hung up and I sat there staring at my wall, and I realized something that made me laugh in the darkest way. When you stop being useful, people call you selfish, and when you start protecting yourself, they call you cruel. I went to legal assistance on base after that, because I wasn't going to let my parents slide into my career with a whisper campaign. The JAG officer listened, asked for documents, and when I handed over the letter, he raised his eyebrows and said, this is bold. And then he gave me a step-by-step plan, not emotional advice, a plan, and that's what saved my sanity, because plans turn fear into action. He said to maintain no contact, to route everything through the detective, to keep records, and to be prepared for a plea offer. A plea offer. Those words sat in my head like a ticking clock. Because a plea offer means Brielle was scared enough to negotiate, and if she was scared, it meant the evidence was stronger than my parents wanted to admit. And then, on a Thursday afternoon, Detective Lewis called me and said, we have something, and her tone wasn't dramatic, but it had that quiet certainty that makes your stomach drop, and I stepped outside into the heat, phone pressed tight to my ear, and she said, we pulled the IP logs and the application timestamps. And then she paused, and then she added, and we found the one detail your parents didn't think anyone would connect. Detective Lewis said they found the one detail my parents didn't think anyone would connect, and I felt my whole body go cold in the Texas heat, because when a detective says it like that, it means the story isn't just my sister is reckless, it's someone helped her, and I already knew exactly who had the access, the timing, the entitlement, and the quiet confidence to pull this off without shaking. I leaned against the side of the building outside my office, the brick warm under my shoulder, and I asked her to repeat it because my brain always tries to bargain with reality the first time, like maybe if I hear it again, it'll sound less awful. Detective Lewis didn't repeat it the same way. She broke it down, step by step, like she was dismantling a bomb. She said the credit applications weren't just submitted from random coffee shop Wi-Fi. They were submitted from a home network that matched my parents' internet provider account. And not only that, several of the applications were completed on a device that had previously been used to log into my mother's email. And then she added the final piece, the one that made my stomach flip. That at least 2 of the card verification calls were answered from my parents' landline, and the security questions were passed clean, like whoever was on that phone knew my childhood street, my first pet, and the exact spelling of my middle name. And in that moment, I didn't even feel rage first. I felt disgust, because that's not a mistake. That's coordination. That's planning. That's a family meeting where my future was treated like a spare tire. I asked Detective Lewis, very calmly, if this meant my parents were being investigated too, and she said, not yet, but it means they're witnesses with knowledge, and it means their testimony is going to matter in a way they're not expecting. I hung up and stared at my boots like I'd forgotten how to be a person for a second, because I kept hearing my father's voice in my head saying, we don't call the police on family. And now I realized why he said it so confidently, because he knew the police would eventually find fingerprints that weren't literal, but were just as damning. I went back inside, sat down at my desk, and I did what I've trained myself to do since I was 19. I turned emotion into a checklist because feelings are loud, but systems are louder if you use them right. I wrote down every single thing Detective Lewis mentioned, IP logs, device history, verification calls, landline, and then I opened my folder again, the paper shield, and I added a new section called parental involvement, because I was done pretending this was only a sibling problem. That same afternoon, I got a message from my father, a simple call me, like he was summoning an employee, and I didn't call him because calling him would give him the microphone, and I'd already watched him use microphones to rewrite reality. Instead, I forwarded his message to Detective Lewis and asked what I should do if he escalated, and she told me, Do not engage. If he threatens you, document it. It's funny, the way a stranger in law enforcement can protect your sanity better than your own blood, because she wasn't asking me to be the bigger person, she was asking me to be safe. That night, my father did escalate, not with a call, but with a visit, because entitlement loves a dramatic entrance. I was getting back to my apartment near base, groceries in one hand, keys in the other, when I saw his truck parked on the curb like a warning sign, and for a second I just stood there, because my entire childhood flashed in my head. Every time he used his physical presence to end a conversation, every time he stood in a doorway and made it clear the discussion was over. He stepped out like he owned the street, and the first thing he said wasn't, "Are you okay?" It was, "You've made this worse." And I almost laughed because of course that was his opener. Blame first, facts later. I told him to step back from me, and he did, but his jaw tightened like he hated being told no. He said my mother was falling apart. He said my sister was not sleeping. He said people are talking. And then he said the line I will never forget. "If you would just stop, we can fix this." And I asked him, how? Because I wanted to hear him say it. I wanted him to admit the plan out loud. He didn't say, "Repay the debt." He didn't say, "Tell the truth." He said, "We'll handle it internally." And I replied, "That's what you said last time, and your version of handling it was making me the payment plan." He stepped closer again, and I could smell his aftershave, that same brand that used to mean "Dad is home," and now it meant danger. And he lowered his voice and said, "You're going to ruin your career over this." That was the threat, finally spoken clearly, and I looked him right in the eye and said, "You already tried to ruin it when you helped her take my name." His face twitched, and that twitch told me everything. He didn't deny it. He went straight to righteous anger, the kind people use when denial won't hold anymore. He said I was accusing him. He said I was disrespectful. He said I'd forgotten where I came from, and I said, "No, I remember exactly where I came from. That's why I know you're capable of this." And then I did the one thing that would have shocked the old me. I opened my phone, hit record, and I told him calmly, "Say what you need to say again." And he stopped mid-breath because bullies hate documentation. He backed up, looked around like he suddenly remembered the world has witnesses, and then he tried a softer voice. Please," and I said, "Leave." And he left, but not before throwing one last sentence like a brick. "Don't expect a family after this." I stood there holding my grocery bag like it weighed 50 pounds, and I felt my throat burn, not from tears, from the effort of not collapsing, because holding your boundary feels like holding your breath underwater the first few times. I went inside and immediately wrote a full incident report for myself, time, location, exact quotes, and then I emailed Detective Lewis that he'd shown up and threatened my career, and she responded fast, "Good. Keep everything." This supports intimidation. The next morning my mother called from a blocked number, and I almost didn't answer, but I did, because part of me still wanted to believe she had a separate soul from my father, that somewhere under the control and the favoritism there was a mother who would hear her child say, "I'm drowning," and actually reach for her. She didn't. She started crying immediately, but not the kind of crying that says, "I hurt you," the kind that says, "You embarrassed me." And she said, "How could you do this to us?" And I said, "How could you do this to me?" And she went quiet, like she genuinely didn't have language for that question. Then she said, "Rachel is your sister," like that was a magic spell. And I said, "And I was your daughter," when she filled out those forms in my name. She tried to pivot to family loyalty, to the idea that blood is thicker. And I told her the truth in the simplest way I could. Blood doesn't pay collections. Blood doesn't protect my clearance. Blood didn't stop her. My mother then said something that actually made my hand shake. She said, "We only did it because you wouldn't help otherwise." And I froze because there it was, the confession wrapped in justification. And then she added, "You always act like you're above needing us." And I realized they'd been resentful of my independence for years, because my independence exposed their dysfunction. And when they couldn't control me with guilt anymore, they tried to control me with consequences. I said, "You just admitted you were involved," and she gasped like I'd slapped her, and she said, "Don't twist my words." And I said, "I'm not twisting anything. I'm finally hearing you clearly." Then she whispered, "If your father goes down for this, it will be your fault." And I felt a calm settle over me that surprised even me, because that sentence told me my mother would rather protect a man's reputation than her child's life. I told her, "If your father goes down for this, it will be because of what he did." And I hung up. After that, something shifted in me, not into cruelty, into clarity, because there's a point where your heart stops begging people to love you correctly and starts building a life that doesn't require their permission. I went back to work. I met with legal again. I updated my commander proactively so no one could blindside him with my father's smear attempts, and my commander nodded and said, "You're handling this like a professional." And it hit me. This is what support looks like. It looks like someone believing you without you having to perform suffering for it. Later that week, Detective Lewis called again, and she said the prosecutor was considering offering my sister a plea, and my mouth went dry because a plea means the walls are closing in, and I asked what the terms might be, and she said, restitution, probation, counseling, no contact. And I asked the question that mattered most, does it include admitting my parents' involvement? And she paused and said, that depends on what she's willing to trade to save herself. And right there is where it got vicious in a new way. Because when the golden child gets cornered, they don't suddenly become honest. They start shopping for a scapegoat. And I knew exactly who she would try to sell to the prosecutor first. And it wouldn't be my parents. It would be me. She'd try to claim I approved it, or I knew, or I benefited. Because that's what people do when they can't face their own reflection. They smear yours. That night I sat on my couch, stared at the ceiling, and thought about how twisted it is that a family can build an entire religion around one child being fragile, and then demand the other child become bulletproof. And I want you to answer this in the comments because I genuinely want to see where people land. If you were in my shoes, would you push for charges against the parents too if the evidence points there? Or would you spare them and only let the sister take the fall because some people believe in cutting off the infected branch, and some people believe you have to treat the root? I went to bed with my phone face down because I didn't want to stare at it like a desperate kid waiting for love, and sometime around midnight it buzzed anyway, and when I flipped it over, it was an email notification from the prosecutor's office with a subject line that made my stomach drop. Proposed plea terms and victim input. And I opened it, scanned it, and saw one sentence buried in the middle that changed everything. Defendant indicates willingness to provide additional information regarding third-party assistance. And I realized the next move wasn't going to be a courtroom speech. It was going to be a negotiation, and somebody was about to name names. The email was written in that cold, professional tone that pretends people aren't bleeding behind the words, and I stared at the phrase third-party assistance like it was a loaded gun sitting on my kitchen table because I knew exactly what it meant. It meant my sister was about to do what she always does when consequences show up. She was going to point at someone else and say they made her do it. And the most dangerous part was she wouldn't even be fully lying because someone did help her. I just didn't know who she was willing to sacrifice first, and I'll be honest with you, the first fear that hit me wasn't about money, it was about narrative, because in families like mine, whoever tells the first believable story wins, and I wasn't going to let my father walk into another room and paint me as the villain before the truth even had its shoes on. The next morning I didn't go to work first. I went to my legal assistant's office on base with a folder so thick it looked like I was carrying a textbook, and the captain behind the desk didn't smile. He just nodded like he'd been expecting me, because once your life becomes a case file, you start seeing how often other people have lived in the same storm. I slid the email across to him, and he read it twice slowly, and then he said, "This is a leverage move." And I asked, "Leverage against who?" And he said, "Whoever she thinks is the safer target." And I said, "That's not me," because I needed to hear myself say it out loud. He told me to request a formal victim input meeting with the prosecutor, not over the phone, in person, or at least on an official recorded call. And he told me to bring a clean timeline, not emotion, because emotion is easy to dismiss, but timelines trap liars. So I went home that evening, and I built a timeline like I was building a patrol plan. I pulled the credit report, matched every account opening date to where I physically was, training schedules, duty rosters, TDY paperwork, the boring stuff that becomes a shield when someone tries to accuse you of being complicit. I highlighted one detail that made my blood boil all over again. 2 of the accounts were opened on a week I was in the field with zero access, sleeping in dust, eating MREs, and the idea that someone was sitting in my parents' house sipping coffee and typing my social into a form while I was out there doing my job felt like a personal insult to the whole concept of honor. Then I pulled Rachel's public posts, not because I love pain, but because evidence is evidence, the mirror selfies, the fresh start captions, the hotel shot with the view, and I lined them up with transaction dates, the way a detective lines up footprints, and the pattern was so obvious it almost became funny in a dark way, because she wasn't even clever, she was just confident nobody would ever hold her accountable. That's the thing about golden children, they don't have to be smart, they just have to be protected. By midnight, my living room floor was covered in papers like a tornado hit a filing cabinet, and I was sitting cross-legged in sweatpants with my hair in a bun, flipping through proof of my own betrayal, and I caught myself laughing once, quietly, because my father used to lecture me about responsibility like it was a family heirloom, and now responsibility was something he only demanded from me. The next day, the prosecutor's office scheduled my meeting, and when I walked into that building it smelled like stale coffee and copier toner, and I kept my shoulders back because it's funny how your body tries to shrink when you're about to be judged, and I wasn't going to shrink in a room where the truth was on my side. The assistant district attorney, Ms. Valdez, greeted me like a person, not like a problem, and that alone nearly cracked me, but I kept it together and she told me straight, "Your sister wants a plea, and she's offering information." And I said, "About my parents," and she didn't confirm it. She just said, "About others involved," and I replied, "If she's offering information, it's because she needs something." And Ms. Valdez nodded like she respected that I understood the game. I asked to see exactly what my sister claimed, and Ms. Valdez told me she couldn't share every detail yet, but she could tell me the direction, and she said, "Your sister is suggesting the accounts were opened with family knowledge," and I felt that old familiar anger rise, the one that says, of course she is, because Rachel would rather poison me than admit she's the poison. I leaned forward and said, "Define family knowledge," and Ms. Valdez said, "She's implying you were aware," and I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was insulting, and I pushed my timeline toward her and said, "Then let's start with physics, because I can't be aware of something I was not even physically present for." Ms. Valdez read my timeline, and I watched her eyes move, date to date, and I could feel the ground getting firmer under my feet, because a lie can be emotional, but it can't outrun paperwork. Halfway through, "I want you to pause and tell me where you're watching from. Seriously, drop your city or even just your country in the comments, because I've learned something through this mess. People love to scream family is family until the day family uses them like an ATM, and I want to know how many of you have lived through that exact switch flipping in someone you trusted." Ms. Valdez looked up and asked me a question that hit deeper than anything she could have asked about money. She said, "Why do you think her parents are supporting her?" And for a second I didn't have a clean answer that sounded polite, because the truth is ugly. So I told her the clean version and the ugly version back to back. I said, "Because my sister is the one they pity, and I'm the one they assume can absorb pain without consequence." And then I said, "And because if they admit she's guilty, they have to admit they raised her." And Ms. Valdez didn't flinch. She just nodded and said, "That's consistent with what we see in these cases." And hearing someone describe your family dynamic as consistent is a special kind of horror, like realizing your personal tragedy is a common template. Then she asked me what outcome I wanted, and this is where people think revenge is the answer, but I'm going to be real with you. I didn't want revenge. I wanted clean separation. I wanted my name back. I wanted my career protected. I wanted the debt not to hang over me like a noose. And I wanted a paper trail that would stop them from rewriting history later. So I told her, I want restitution and no contact order, and I want the record to reflect that I did not consent, I did not know, and I did not benefit. And then I added, and if the evidence leads to anyone else, I want that addressed too, because I wasn't going to protect the people who refused to protect me. Ms. Valda said something then that made my throat go tight. She said, "Your father may testify again." And I asked, "Against me?" And she said, "He's indicated strong feelings." And I said, "Of course he has, because accountability feels like betrayal when you've been getting away with things." And she gave me a look like she'd heard that sentence before. She told me the next hearing would likely include conditions being set, no contact, passport surrender, and the judge would weigh whether the plea was acceptable. And then she said, "There's one more thing," and she slid a single page across to me, and at the top was a list of phone numbers associated with the fraudulent accounts, and I recognized one instantly. Not my sister's, not mine, my mother's old number from years ago. The one she still uses for family stuff, and my skin went cold. Because it meant my mother wasn't just adjacent to this, she was inside it. I looked up at Ms. Valdez and said, "That's my mom." And she said, "We noticed." And then she said, "This is why your sister's offer matters." And I heard the unspoken part. Your sister is about to bargain with your parents' involvement. And the question is whether she'll finally tell the truth or just rearrange the blame. I walked out of that building feeling two things at once. Relief because the system was taking this seriously, and dread because the closer you get to justice, the more desperate people get to stop it. When I got back to my apartment, there was a package on my doorstep with no return address, and I know that sounds small, but my instincts went loud, because nothing in my life was random anymore. I carried it inside, set it on the table, and stared at it like it might hiss, and I didn't open it at first. I took photos of every side, label, tape seams, because that's what you do when your own family has proven they're comfortable crossing lines. I texted Detective Lewis and asked if I should open it, and she said, "Not alone." And that one sentence told me more than any lecture ever could. It told me this had graduated from a family argument into a risk assessment. I waited until my neighbor was home, a staff sergeant's wife who doesn't play, and she stood in my kitchen with her arms crossed while I carefully sliced the tape. And inside was a single object wrapped in newspaper, and when I unwrapped it, my heart actually stuttered, because it was an old framed photo of me in my dress blues from my first promotion, except someone had taken a black marker and drawn an X over my face, thick and angry like a child's tantrum, and taped to the glass was a sticky note in my mother's handwriting that said, "Stop before you destroy us." I didn't cry, I didn't scream, I just felt that calm again, the same calm I felt when my father threatened me, because intimidation is a confession in costume, and if they were sending messages like this, it meant the pressure was working, it meant the truth was close enough to touch. And then my phone buzzed with an unknown number, and when I answered, a woman's voice said, "Sergeant Carter, this is the courthouse clerk. Your case has been moved up." And my stomach dropped, because moved up means something happened, and as she read the new date, I realized my sister didn't just offer information, she set something in motion, and the next time we were all in that courtroom together, somebody was going to say the name out loud. The moved up date didn't feel like good news, it felt like a trap snapping shut faster than anyone expected, because when courts move fast it usually means somebody panicked, somebody talked, somebody tried to control the damage before it spread, and the first thing I did wasn't call my parents, wasn't call my sister, I called my chain of command, because the military doesn't care about your family drama, it cares about risk, and unexplained debt plus court appearances equals questions, and I refused to let my career be collateral damage in my sister's little fresh start fantasy. My commander didn't yell, he didn't lecture, he did something scarier, he got quiet and practical. He asked me for the updated docket number, he asked what restrictions were in place, and then he told me, You're not handling this alone anymore. And just hearing that, hearing someone say the opposite of what my father always said, something in my chest loosened. That same afternoon, I met with legal assistants again, and they didn't treat it like gossip. They treated it like a plan. They told me exactly what to do in the next 72 hours. Step 1, document intimidation. Step 2, lock my credit like my life depended on it, because it kind of did. Step 3, request a written no-contact modification so my family couldn't keep playing the "we're just worried about her" card while leaving threats on my doorstep. I went home and pulled up my credit bureau accounts, all 3, and I froze everything, not because I was scared of a new account, but because I was done being surprised. And then I set fraud alerts, and then I printed the confirmation pages, and then I scanned them, and then I emailed them to myself. And yes, it sounds obsessive, but when you've been violated financially, detail becomes oxygen. Because the banks don't care how betrayed you feel. They care about forms, timestamps, and proof. And then making that list of actions turned into something else, because the more I worked, the more I realized the biggest danger wasn't the trial. The biggest danger was the story my family was trying to sell. The one where I was vindictive and my sister was sensitive and my parents were caught in the middle, because that narrative is what makes judges soften. It's what makes extended family whisper. It's what makes people look at you like you're heartless for refusing to be used. So I built a second file, not the financial one, the human one. I wrote down every phrase my father used when he tried to pressure me. This is family. We don't call police. You're strong. And I wrote down the dates because patterns matter more than feelings in court. And then I pulled my voicemail recordings, and then I exported my call logs. And then I took photos of the defaced military photo and my mother's sticky note. And then I wrote a 1-page incident summary with exact language. Because I wasn't going to walk into a courtroom and sound like a rattled daughter. I was going to sound like a witness with receipts. The next morning I drove to the courthouse early, not because I had to, but because I needed to see the building in daylight, to make it smaller in my mind, and I sat in the parking lot with my hands on the steering wheel, watching people shuffle in with coffee cups and tired faces, and I realized something darkly funny. Everybody in that building thinks their problem is the biggest thing in the world. And the truth is the judge has seen worse before lunch, which means my job wasn't to be dramatic. My job was to be clear. Inside, the hallway smelled like old paper and disinfectant, and a bailiff nodded at me like he'd seen me before, and that tiny recognition felt like confirmation that I wasn't invisible here, even if I was invisible at my parents' kitchen table. When they called us in, Rachel was already seated with her attorney, hair pulled tight, eyes down, the performance of regret without the inconvenience of accountability, and my parents sat behind her again, but closer this time, like they wanted the judge to feel their presence, like emotional pressure counts as evidence. My father didn't look at me. He stared straight ahead, jaw clenched like he was the one being wronged, and my mother's hands were folded so tightly her knuckles looked pale, and I could almost hear the prayer in her posture. Let the judge save us from consequences. The judge entered and the courtroom stood, and I felt my heartbeat thump in my ears again, but this time it wasn't panic, it was focus, like my body was saying, fine, we're doing this. The prosecutor started by stating the updated motion, accelerated hearing due to new information provided by the defendant, and that phrase made the room shift, because new information is the polite way of saying someone decided the truth was a bargaining chip. Rachel's attorney asked for leniency and family context, and my stomach tightened because that's always the move, wrap a crime in tissue paper and call it complicated. And then the judge asked the prosecutor a question I didn't expect. She asked if there had been attempts to contact or pressure the victim, and the prosecutor said yes. And then she turned to me and asked if I had documentation. And this is where my parents finally looked at me, because for the first time their strategy depended on me staying quiet, and I didn't. I handed over the photos, the incident summary, the voicemail transcript, and I watched my father's face tighten as if I'd slapped him, not because he felt guilty, but because he felt exposed. And then the judge read my mother's sticky note out loud. Stop before you destroy us. and the courtroom got so quiet you could hear paper shifting, and my mother's breath caught, and Rachel's attorney tried to interrupt, and the judge shut it down with one raised hand. And in that moment, I wanted to ask you something. Where are you watching from right now? What city, what country? Because I promise you, there are people listening who have lived this exact thing. The moment you realize your family's version of love is really just a demand for your silence, and I want those people to know they're not crazy. The judge looked up and said, "This appears to be intimidation," and my father's head snapped slightly like he couldn't believe the word applied to them, and that's when the judge did something that felt like oxygen entering a locked room. She expanded the no-contact conditions. No direct contact, no third-party contact, no gifts, no messages, no accidental visits, nothing. And then she looked at Rachel and said, "Your plea offer includes information. Is that correct?" And Rachel nodded, eyes glossy, and the judge said, "I want to hear the outline." And the prosecutor stood and summarized, not every detail, but enough to make my stomach go cold. The accounts were opened at the parents' address. The verification calls were answered from a number associated with the household, and there was evidence suggesting assistance in obtaining personal documents. Assistance. That word landed like a weight, because it matched what I'd already seen on that list of phone numbers, and my mother's face went waxy, and my father's jaw worked like he was chewing on a lie. Rachel's attorney objected, tried to frame it as family confusion, and the judge cut through it with one sentence: "There is no confusion about whose name was used." And then she asked Rachel directly, "Did anyone help you access Sergeant Carter's identification documents?" And Rachel hesitated, and you could feel the whole room leaning forward, because hesitation is where truth tries to escape, and my father's hand moved, just slightly, toward Rachel's shoulder like a warning. And then the judge noticed it, because judges notice everything when they're deciding who's manipulating who, and she said sharply, "Hands to yourself." And my father jerked back like he'd been burned. Rachel swallowed. Her voice came out small. "I didn't do it alone." And my mother made a sound that wasn't a sob. It was more like a crack, like her reality split, and my father stood up too fast. "This is not what you think." And the judge told him to sit down. And then she said the line that will live in my head forever: "Sir, you do not get to manage this courtroom the way you manage your home." And I swear I felt my spine straighten on its own, because finally someone was naming the dynamic, not just the crime. The judge didn't sentence anyone that day, but she did something that felt like justice taking its first real breath. She ordered a deeper investigation into facilitation. She ordered preservation of household devices tied to the accounts, and she made it clear any attempt to pressure me would result in immediate consequences for the defendant and potential referral for others. And as she said it, my father's face hardened into that familiar disgust, the one that says, "How dare you make me look bad?" And that's when it hit me. My parents weren't scared for Rachel. They were scared of exposure, because if the court pulled the thread, the whole sweater would unravel. Not just the fraud, but the years of favoritism and the quiet deals, and the way they used my strength as permission to treat me as disposable. After we were dismissed, Rachel finally turned her head just enough to look at me, and her eyes weren't apologetic. They were furious, because now she'd confessed she wasn't alone, and she wanted me to feel responsible for what that confession would do to her safety net. And my father walked past me without speaking, but my mother lingered for half a second, eyes wet, mouth trembling, and she whispered, "You didn't have to do all this." And I said quietly, "You didn't have to make me." And she flinched like the truth physically hurt. I walked out of that courthouse into bright sun and cold air, and my phone buzzed with a message from Detective Harris. "We need to talk today." And my stomach dropped again, because I knew what that meant. The investigation wasn't just about Rachel anymore. And then, as if the universe wanted to keep tightening the screws, I got another alert. Not a credit alert this time, a notification from my apartment complex portal. Emergency maintenance access logged. And I froze, because I hadn't requested maintenance and my lease was under my name only, and the thought hit me so fast it felt like ice water. Somebody had tried to get into my new space, and the question wasn't whether my family would cross another line. The question was how far they were willing to go now that the court had taken their favorite weapon away, my silence. The moment I saw that emergency maintenance access logged notification, my brain did what it always does now. It stopped feeling and started calculating, because when your identity gets stolen by someone who knows your childhood address, your birthday, your mother's maiden name, and your soft spots, you learn fast that panic is expensive and process is protection. So I didn't call my mom, I didn't call my dad. I didn't even call Detective Harris first. I took a screenshot of the notification. Then I screen recorded the portal history showing the timestamp, unit number, and the maintenance staff ID. Then I opened my email and forwarded the portal alert to myself with a subject line, evidence access log. Because if this turned into he said, she said, I wanted time and metadata on my side. Then I called the apartment office, not with anger, with that controlled calm that makes people take you seriously, and I asked who submitted the request, what exactly was the issue, and who entered my unit. And the manager started with the usual script. It's probably a system error, and I cut it off politely. No, it's a security issue, and I need the exact name and exact maintenance ticket number right now. And then she paused, and that pause told me everything. Because staff only pause like that when they realize you're not just complaining, you're documenting. She pulled it up and said the request came in by phone earlier that morning. Caller claimed to be my father, used my full name, claimed there was a water leak emergency, and insisted they enter immediately because my daughter is military and unreachable. My stomach didn't flip, it went cold and flat, because the audacity was almost impressive, the way they used my job like a crowbar, like my service was a tool to pry open my door. The manager started apologizing, but I didn't let her drown me in sorry. I asked her to read the phone number the request came from, and it was my father's number. The same one that used to call me after a promotion. The same one that used to say, proud of you, before it became, how could you embarrass us? Then I asked the question that matters. Did anyone enter? And she said yes. Maintenance went in, looked around, couldn't find a leak, left and closed the ticket, and for a second I just stared at the wall in my kitchen because now it wasn't hypothetical intimidation, it was physical, it was my actual home, the one thing I'd rebuilt that was supposed to be mine. I asked for the maintenance guy's name, asked if there were hallway cameras, asked if they could pull footage, and she said they had cameras in the corridor and the lobby, and that footage could be requested by police, and I said, good, don't delete it, flag it, and email me a written incident report, and she promised she would, and then she asked me if I wanted to change my locks, and I said, yes, and I'm adding a passcode to my account. No one enters without it, not even family. Especially not family. Then I hung up and finally called Detective Harris, and the moment she answered, I didn't tell her the feelings, I told her the facts, the ticket, the number, the access log, the time window, the possible camera footage, and she went quiet for a beat and said, that's witness intimidation, and it may also be a violation of the court's no-contact order if it's tied to the case. And I said, it is tied, because the caller used the exact phrasing they've used for weeks, military, unreachable, trying to make me look unstable or absent. And she said, email me everything now. So I did. I sent the screenshots, the screen recording, the manager's written summary in my notes, and then I drove straight to the leasing office to put my instructions in writing because I wanted a paper trail so tight it could cut glass. At the office, the manager looked nervous when she saw me, like she expected me to scream. And when I didn't, when I just slid a printed copy of the portal alert across the counter and asked her to initial next to the timestamp, she realized this wasn't drama, it was a report, and then she walked me to the security desk and I filled out a no entry without passcode form. And I set the passcode to something my family would never guess, not my birthday, not a pet name, not my rank, something meaningless to them. And then I asked them to add a note to my file. If any caller claims to be a parent, deny and call me directly, and they typed it in right in front of me, and I watched it appear on the screen because I've learned not to trust promises you can't verify. And right there, Standing in that bland office with flyers about pool rules and quiet hours, I felt the same strange grief I'd felt reading my credit report, because it's not just money or locks. It's the fact that your own parents can look at your boundaries and treat them like a challenge. On the drive back, my phone lit up with a new text from an unknown number, no name, just a message that said, "You're pushing this too far. You're going to regret it." And it was so generic it could have been anybody, but my body recognized the tone instantly. That family voice that pretends it's concern while it's really a threat dressed up in Sunday clothes. I didn't respond. I took a screenshot, then I forwarded it to Detective Harris. Then I blocked it because I'm done feeding the machine that runs on my reaction. Later that night, I sat at my table and mapped out every moving piece like it was an operation, because that's the only way to survive betrayal without turning into a shaking mess. And the pieces were ugly: Rachel's plea, my parents' pressure campaign, the judge's new orders, and now a physical attempt to access my apartment. And I realized the pattern was escalating in one direction: control. They couldn't control the courtroom anymore, so they tried to control my environment. And if they couldn't control my environment, they tried to control my reputation. And that's when my phone buzzed again. This time it was a voicemail from my mother, and I could hear she'd been crying, but not the tender kind, the offended kind, the kind that says, "How dare you make me feel consequences?" And she said, "Emily, this is not you. You're letting the military turn you cold. You need to stop before you destroy this family." And I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was familiar. Because even now she was blaming my job instead of their choices. I saved the voicemail, labeled it, sent it to Detective Harris. And then I did something I never thought I'd do. I called the base legal office again and asked them to advise me on a protective order and a formal trespass notice, because I wanted my building to have the authority to remove them if they showed up, and the attorney told me exactly how it works. You submit the police report, you document the incident, you notify the property management in writing, and then if they appear, it's not family conflict. It's trespass, it's enforceable. And hearing those words gave me an odd kind of peace, because it meant the rules existed outside my family's emotions. And before I keep going, I want to ask you something right in the middle of this. Where are you watching from right now? What city, what state, what country? Because I know there's somebody listening who has had to lock their own family out of their life to stay safe, and people love to judge that choice until they've lived it. So tell me where you're listening from, and tell me honestly, if your parents tried to force their way into your home after destroying your finances, what would you do? Would you still call it family, or would you call it what it is, intimidation? The next day at work, my commander pulled me aside and said Detective Harris had reached out to coordinate, and he told me my unit had my back, but he also said something that hit me hard. He said, "Your family is using your discipline against you. They expect you to stay composed and quiet." And I just nodded, because that's exactly it. My strength had been their favorite weapon. They used it like a sponge: soak up the mess, keep the peace, don't make noise. That afternoon, Detective Harris called again and said they were requesting the apartment camera footage and that they'd traced that unknown number that texted me. And it wasn't random. It was a burner tied to an account that had also been used to create one of Rachel's online purchases, meaning the intimidation wasn't a separate thing. It was part of the same system, the same messy web of entitlement and panic. And then she told me the part that made my stomach drop. She said, "Rachel is claiming she didn't have access to your documents at first." And I said, "That's a lie." And she said, "I know, but she's trying to point the finger somewhere else. And you need to prepare for the possibility that this will expand beyond just her." And I went quiet because I suddenly understood why my father tried to get into my apartment. It wasn't just to scare me. It was to search, to see what I had, to see if I'd kept records, to see if I had papers that linked them to the accounts. Because when guilty people feel the walls closing in, they don't repent, they rummage. That night I didn't sleep, not because I was afraid, but because my mind wouldn't stop connecting dots. And around 2 a.m., I got an email from my apartment manager with the incident report attached, and I read it like it was a confession. And there it was in black and white. Caller identified as father. requested emergency access, no leak found, and at the bottom she'd added, "We apologize and will cooperate with law enforcement." And I sat back and stared at the ceiling, because now I had what I needed. Proof that they tried to breach my space using my identity, but proof is also fuel, because once you have proof, you have to decide what to do with it, and that's when my phone buzzed again. This time it was a notification from the courthouse portal. Motion filed by defendant. And the title of the motion made my heart punch once hard. Request to modify no-contact order due to family reconciliation. And I swear, in that moment, I could hear my father's voice in my head, smooth and confident, trying to wrap a cage in the word, peace. And I knew the next hearing wasn't going to be about money anymore. It was going to be about whether the court believed their story that I was overreacting, or the truth that they were escalating because they were running out of control. The day of that motion hearing, I showed up early, not because I was nervous, but because I wanted to watch the room fill up and see who walked in with who, because family betrayal isn't just what they do, it's who they stand beside when the truth is sitting right there. I wore the same navy blazer, same plain blouse, hair tight, no jewelry, no softness for them to grab onto and twist into. She's unstable. And I walked through the courthouse metal detector like I belonged there, because I did. I belonged in any room where the truth was being decided. The hallway outside the courtroom smelled like old paper and that burnt coffee they keep in the vending machine area, and the benches were cold, and I sat with my folder on my lap, not like a victim, like a witness to my own life, because that's what they tried to take from me, the right to be the narrator. Then I heard it, my father's laugh, low and familiar, and my stomach did that thing where it tightens even when you're not scared, because your body remembers patterns before your brain finishes the sentence. My parents walked in first, together, two together, like they'd rehearsed the posture in the car, shoulders aligned, faces calm, carrying that performance calm they've always used when they want to look like the reasonable ones. Rachel came in behind them with her attorney, eyes down, hair pulled back, and I watched her hands, because hands tell the truth when faces lie, and her fingers were twitching, restless, like she was fighting the urge to grab the nearest excuse and run. My father didn't look at me at first. He looked past me, like I was a stain on the wall that would disappear if he refused to acknowledge it, and then he sat and leaned in to whisper to Rachel, and I caught a couple words, "Just stay calm." And it hit me, because the whole plan was calm. Calm is how they sell cruelty. Calm is how they make the victim look dramatic for reacting like a human. When the bailiff called the case, we stood, the judge took her seat, and she looked tired again, not bored, tired in the way people get tired when they've seen too many families try to use the court like a therapist and a priest at the same time. Rachel's attorney spoke first, talking about restoring family unity, and a misunderstanding, and a path forward, and the words were so slippery I could practically see them sliding off the walls. And then my father stood and asked to address the court, and when the judge allowed it, he put on that voice, the one he used at church potlucks and parent-teacher meetings, the "I'm a good man" voice, and he said, "Your Honor, we just want our daughters to reconcile. We want to move on. We want healing, and Sergeant Carter is refusing to let the family heal." I stared at him because the audacity was almost artful, the way he turned accountability into bitterness and justice into revenge, and I could feel my jaw clench, but I didn't react because I'd learned the trap. The trap is they poke you until you flinch, and then point at your flinch as proof you're the problem. The judge asked Rachel's attorney why the no-contact order should be modified, and he said, "There's no continued threat," and my brain almost laughed, because I had a whole folder labeled continued threat. I had an apartment incident report, I had a portal access log, I had the voicemail, I had the burner number threat, I had the maintenance ticket, I had the camera footage request in progress, and I had the simple fact that someone tried to access my home under my name while a criminal case was active, which is not no threat. That is the definition of threat with extra steps. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't start with my feelings, I started with the timeline, because feelings get argued with, and timelines don't. I said, "Your Honor, The defendant's family called my apartment complex and impersonated my parent to obtain emergency access, and I have an incident report and portal logs with timestamps. I have a threatening message from a burner number, and the detective has connected it to an account tied to the fraudulent activity, and I have a voicemail pressuring me to drop the case. I watched my father's face as I spoke, because I wanted to see which part made him flinch. And the first flinch came at apartment complex. His eyes moved, quick, like he was checking the room for who knew what, and the second flinch came at burner number, because that one isn't a mistake. That one is intent. My mother shook her head like she was disappointed, like I'd told a rude joke, and it made me angry in a clean way, the kind of anger that clarifies instead of blurs, because it reminded me that my mother's favorite move is moralizing, not apologizing. The judge asked my father directly, "Did you contact her apartment complex?" And he said, "No." Too fast, and the judge lifted her chin slightly, then asked, "Did you request emergency access?" And he said, "No." Again, and then the judge looked at me and said, "Do you have documentation?" And I handed the clerk the incident report and the screenshot of the portal log and the email from the manager confirming the request originated from my father's phone number, and the judge read it quietly. And I could hear the paper shift, and I swear the room temperature changed. My father started to speak, but the judge held up a hand, and she said, calm as winter, "Sir, this report indicates the caller used her number and identified himself as the victim's father, claimed she was unreachable due to military duties, and requested emergency access and maintenance, entered and found no leak, and my father's mouth opened, and my mother inhaled like she was about to cry, but not because she felt bad, because she'd been caught. And right in the middle of this, let me ask you, where are you watching from right now? What city and state? Because I need you to understand how common this is. People think identity theft is some stranger in a hoodie, but half the time it's someone at your holiday table, someone who knows your life well enough to weaponize it. So tell me where you're watching from, and tell me if you've ever had to protect yourself from family the way you'd protect yourself from a stranger, because I want your honest take on this. The judge asked another question. If you truly want reconciliation, why are you attempting to access her private residence during an active case? And my father said, we were worried about her. And the judge didn't even blink. She said, then you call. You do not enter. And that one sentence felt like it cut the air because it was the simplest truth. Concern does not break into your home. Rachel's attorney tried to pivot, saying, the defendant didn't do that. And the judge nodded, which suggests ongoing pressure from those around her. And then she turned to Rachel and asked, do you understand why the no-contact order exists? And Rachel finally looked up, and her eyes were hard, not remorseful, hard like mine were once hard when I believed strength meant swallowing everything, and she said, yes. But her voice had no weight behind it, like she was reading a line to get out of trouble. The judge then asked me, has there been any attempt at restitution beyond the court-ordered payments? And I said, only what the court required, nothing voluntary, no apology that included action. And my father shifted, and my mother's face tightened, because I'd said the quiet part out loud. They only do the right thing when the system forces them, and that's not character, that's compliance. Then the judge delivered the kind of truth you feel in your bones. She said, the motion to modify is denied, the no-contact order remains, and any further attempt to contact or access the victim directly or indirectly may result in additional charges. My mother let out a sound like she'd been slapped. My father stared straight ahead, and Rachel's shoulders dropped slightly, not in defeat, in irritation, like the judge had inconvenienced her. And that was the moment I stopped hoping for a family apology, because hope is expensive when it keeps you returning to a place that keeps cutting you. Outside the courtroom, my father tried one last move. He walked toward me like he was going to speak, and for 1 second I saw the old version of him, the one I'd wanted back, and then he said quietly, you're going to end up alone. And I looked at him and realized he meant it as a curse, because in his world, being alone is worse than being exploited, and I said, No, Dad, I ended up free. And I walked away. Detective Harris met me in the hallway and told me the camera footage from the apartment was being preserved, and that because of the false emergency entry attempt, they were opening an additional investigation into witness intimidation and potential conspiracy around the fraud. And that word conspiracy is heavy, because it means the system was looking past the sister and toward the network that enabled her. Over the next few months, things moved like a slow machine. Banks updated their records. Fraud claims closed. My credit score crawled upward. I kept every letter, every email, every payment receipt, and each time Rachel's restitution deposit landed, I didn't celebrate, I just noted it because the point wasn't money. The point was the burden was no longer living inside my chest. Then one afternoon, I got the call that finally snapped the last thread of illusion. Detective Harris told me my father had been formally warned and that the prosecutor was considering whether to add charges based on the apartment entry attempt and the burner number threat. And I sat there staring at my kitchen counter, and I didn't feel triumph. I felt that quiet, terrifying relief of knowing the truth has momentum now. It doesn't need me to beg for it. I started sleeping again, not perfectly, but better, and I stopped checking my credit report like it was a heartbeat monitor, and I started letting my life belong to me. And the craziest part is how small the changes were at first. A morning where I hummed without noticing, an evening where my phone didn't control my pulse, a weekend where I didn't drive home to fix a mess that wasn't mine. And look, I'm not going to pretend this is wrapped in a bow, because it isn't. The grief still shows up, the kind of grief that comes from realizing your parents loved the role you played more than the person you are. But I learned something that matters. Loyalty that requires self-destruction is not loyalty. It's a hostage situation with nicer vocabulary. If you've been carrying someone else's consequences because you were labeled the strong one, I want you to hear this like a direct message to your nervous system. You do not have to be strong in silence. You can be strong in truth. And if the people who raised you call that betrayal, that's not your shame. That's their mirror. Now here's what I need from you. Tell me in the comments, did I handle this the right way, or would you have done something different? And be specific, because I want the debate, I want the real takes, and if you've lived a version of this, drop your story too, because someone reading it is going to feel less crazy. And if you think this was the end, it wasn't, because what happened next wasn't in the courtroom. It was in the paperwork, the financial audit trail, the hidden accounts, the thing my family never expected me to find. And I'm telling you right now, the next story you need to watch is the one where I show you exactly how I traced the fraud beyond Rachel and why that discovery changed everything about who I considered family and who I considered a threat.